In the blistering heat of a Nevada highway, the line between life and death is often painted in blood and gasoline. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but on that scorching afternoon, one of the most powerful mafia bosses on the East Coast learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. Marin Holloway, a 17-year-old runaway, wanted by the state, starving and terrified, made a choice that day. When a delivery van crushed a young man against the asphalt, Marin didn't run. She stayed. Even when the flames began to lick the sky, even when the roar of black SUVs shook the ground beneath her feet, what happened next wasn't just a rescue. It was a war for a girl's soul that would bring the most dangerous man in America to his knees. This is the true story of the girl who wouldn't let go. If this story moved you, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story of courage, survival, and the families we choose. See you in the next one. Marin Holloway walked along the shoulder of Interstate 15, her worn-out sneakers dragging through the scorching gravel. She was 17 years old, but looking at her now, someone might mistake her for a ghost wandering through the desert. An oversized gray hoodie covered her head, hiding the tangled brown hair that hadn't been washed for days. Beneath the heavy fabric, her body was so thin that her shoulder blades pressed sharply against the cloth, like the fragile wings of a bird about to break. Her dark brown eyes never stopped scanning the world around her, alert and wary like a wild animal long accustomed to being hunted. Each time a car sped past, she lowered her head slightly and pulled in on herself, trying to shrink, trying to become invisible beneath the burning Nevada sun. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she climbed out of her bedroom window in Sacramento and disappeared into the night. Inside the faded pocket of her jeans were $14 and a few loose coins. The old backpack slung over her shoulder held half of a protein bar, an empty water bottle, and everything she owned in the world. She didn't carry a phone because she was afraid of being tracked. She had no identification because she left it behind in that house of hell. All she had were aching legs and the stubborn will to survive. The memory of the last night was still fresh, raw as an open wound. Douglas Pratt, the man the system called her foster father, had come home drunk. Marin could still remember the sharp smell of whiskey, the heavy footsteps on the stairs, and the cloudy eyes filled with hatred when he shoved open her bedroom door. That night she curled up on the floor, her ribs aching so badly she could barely breathe, and she made a promise to herself that if she survived until morning she would never go back. Never. Marin had learned many things during 10 years inside the foster care system. She learned how to recognize danger just by looking into an adult's eyes. She learned to find the nearest exit in any room before she ever considered sitting down. She learned how to disappear, how to become a shadow, how to become no one at all, because no one meant no one could hurt you. Her goal was painfully simple: survive until she turned 18. Less than 1 year left. Just 1 more year and she would be free from the system. Free from men like Pratt. Free from the lies people told about family and safety. A gas station appeared ahead like an oasis in the Mojave Desert. It was old and worn, with a faded sign, rusting pumps, and a small convenience store sitting quietly beneath the blazing sun. Marin pushed the door open and stepped inside, the small bell chiming above her head. Cold air from the air conditioner rushed against her face like an embrace. She stood there for a moment, closing her eyes, letting the coolness wash over her before walking toward the shelves. 1 bottle of water. That was all she needed. Marin stood at the counter and poured the coins into her palm, counting them one by one. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with sun-bleached blonde hair, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Marin hated that look. She didn't need anyone's pity. She only needed to be left alone. Outside again, Marin twisted open the bottle and took a long drink. The cold water slid down her dry throat, and she let out a quiet breath of relief. No one was looking for her. No one cared, and that was both a curse and a blessing. A curse because she was completely alone in this world. A blessing because at least no one was hunting her. Or at least, that was what she believed. Marin was about to start walking again when she suddenly froze. A convoy of black vehicles appeared from the highway, turning into the gas station like a pack of wolves moving in perfect formation. 4 glossy black Escalades. 2 Mercedes Maybachs with dark-tinted windows reflecting the blinding sun. Everything about that convoy radiated one clear message: danger. And Marin Holloway, the girl who had survived by instinct alone, knew she needed to disappear immediately. Marin stepped back 1 pace, the survival instinct sharpened by 10 years of hardship snapping instantly into place. She slipped quietly into the narrow space between the gas station wall and a large dumpster, where the shade swallowed her shape and no one would notice her unless they deliberately searched. From a thin gap, she watched the convoy come to a halt. The doors opened at the same time, moving with the precision of a routine practiced hundreds of times. The men stepped out one by one. Every one of them wore perfectly tailored black suits, crisp white shirts, and straight, immaculate ties. They did not resemble the businessmen Marin had seen on television or on the streets of Sacramento. Ordinary businessmen seemed soft, harmless, almost safe. These men were something else entirely. Their movements were swift and exact, like trained soldiers. Their eyes swept the area the way wolves study the edges of a forest, measuring every shadow, every corner, every possible threat. The muscles beneath their jackets were taut, and Marin could swear she caught the outline of pistols concealed under the coats of at least 3 of them. This was a different level of danger. This was the kind of world where even Douglas Pratt would have lowered his head. Marin's heart began to beat faster when the last man stepped out of the leading Maybach. He stood taller than the others, perhaps 6 feet 2, with a lean frame that carried the quiet strength of a resting panther. His black hair was brushed neatly back, streaked with silver at the temples, the mark of a man no longer young but far from old. His charcoal 3-piece suit fit him like it had been shaped stitch by stitch for his body alone. But what made Marin hold her breath was not the expensive elegance of his appearance. It was his eyes, steel gray, cold as winter metal, sharp as a blade. They moved across the gas station with the calm indifference of a man accustomed to owning everything he looked at. The moment he appeared, the people around him fell silent without a word being spoken. No one gave an order. No one demanded quiet. Yet even the air itself seemed to thicken in the presence of this man. One of his subordinates stepped close and leaned in to say something quietly. Marin strained her ears and caught fragments carried by the hot wind. "Make sure he gets back to school safely. No mistakes." The silver-haired man's voice was low and steady, like small stones rolling beneath a shallow stream. It was not loud. It was not hurried. Yet it carried an authority so absolute that no one listening would even consider defying it. The subordinate nodded at once and walked away as if he had just received instructions from an uncrowned king. Marin glanced toward the rear of the convoy and noticed a white Range Rover parked at the end. The vehicle looked strangely out of place among the dark procession, like a pale bird flying through a night sky. Leaning against it was a young man, perhaps 20 or 21, with light brown hair and a face that seemed surprisingly gentle among men surrounded by quiet violence. He rested against the door with a phone to his ear, laughing as he spoke to someone on the other end. His smile was bright and carefree, as though he did not realize he stood in the middle of a gathering of cold-blooded men. Marin frowned slightly. Who was he? A son? A younger brother? Or just some innocent soul accidentally pulled into this world? She did not know, and she did not want to know. People like her should never become entangled with people like them. Never. The convoy remained for no more than 5 minutes, while the drivers filled their tanks, and a few men stepped into the convenience store. Then the engines roared to life again. Tires crushed the gravel. Dust lifted into the air like a small desert storm. The white Range Rover followed behind, and soon the entire convoy shrank into distant dark specks along the horizon. Marin let out a quiet breath of relief and leaned back against the sun-heated wall. She waited 10 minutes, then 20, making certain they were truly gone before stepping out of her hiding place. She did not want to see them again. She did not want those cold gray eyes to sweep across her, not even for a second. As she walked, Marin told herself she had been lucky. That convoy, those men, that world had nothing to do with her. She was only an invisible ghost on the highway, and she would remain invisible until she reached Las Vegas, found work, and vanished completely from the system. She had escaped, or at least she believed she had. Marin did not know that just 2 miles ahead on the same road, hell was waiting, and that her fate would soon become forever bound to the man with the cold steel eyes she had tried so hard to avoid. 2 miles farther down Interstate 15, Marin sensed that something was wrong before her eyes even confirmed it. Traffic ahead had suddenly ground to a halt. Cars were lined up across the highway like a herd of frightened animals frozen in place. Horns blared from every direction, mixing with distant shouts carried through the hot air. Marin walked along the shoulder of the road, and from that angle she could see straight ahead without the line of vehicles blocking her view. Then she heard it. The first sound was the scream of metal, a tearing shriek that ripped through the air so violently it would stay in her memory for the rest of her life. After that came the explosion of shattering glass, like thousands of crystals smashing against concrete. Then the desperate howl of brakes, shrill and frantic and utterly useless. Marin began moving forward, not entirely sure why her legs had started to run. As she drew closer, the world seemed to slip into slow motion. A white delivery van loaded with heavy equipment was tipping sideways across the road, its front tire blown apart, burnt rubber filling the air with a bitter stench. The van had lost control and burst across the median like a steel monster thrashing wildly out of its cage. And its target was the white Range Rover traveling ahead. Marin recognized that vehicle instantly, the car at the end of the black convoy. The car that belonged to the young man with the gentle smile. In the instant the van came crashing down, Marin felt as if time itself had stopped breathing. She saw twisted fragments of metal folding in on themselves. She saw shards of glass spinning upward into the sunlight, like droplets of water caught in the air. She heard the horrifying crunch as tons of steel collapsed onto the SUV, crushing it against the asphalt as if it were nothing more than a child's toy. Then, everything stopped. A terrible silence spread across the highway for a few seconds before chaos rushed in to fill the space. Marin stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror at the sight before her. The white Range Rover was no longer a vehicle. It was a mangled heap of metal trapped beneath the weight of the overturned van. Broken glass glittered across the pavement like scattered diamonds that were nothing but deception. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the thick stench of gasoline, flooding her nose with something sharp and frightening. Gasoline. Marin saw the clear liquid spilling from the wrecked van, spreading slowly across the sun-scorched asphalt beneath the brutal Nevada sun. Her heart tightened. One spark, just one tiny spark, and everything would become hell. Around her, drivers began pulling over and stepping out of their vehicles, but none of them came closer. They stood at a distance with their phones raised, filming, whispering in frightened voices. A few people were already calling 911. Their voices shaking as they tried to describe the location and what had happened. Yet not a single person moved toward the wreckage. Who could blame them? Gasoline was pouring onto the road. The van's engine was smoking. Anyone who went near it could die. Marin turned slightly, ready to walk away. She was ready to keep moving, to leave this place behind, to vanish the way she had done her entire life. This was not her problem. She didn't know anyone in that car. She was only an invisible ghost. And ghosts didn't save people. Then she heard it. A weak cry for help drifting out from the twisted metal, fragile as a final breath. Help. Please. Someone. The voice of a young man, full of pain and desperation and a terrible loneliness. Marin stood 20 meters from the crash. The smell of gasoline was growing stronger by the second. The smoke from the engine was thickening in the air. Every survival instinct inside her screamed a single command. Run. Run now. But that cry for help kept echoing in her mind, repeating again and again like a voice rising out of her own past. The battle inside Marin's mind lasted only a few seconds, but to her it stretched across an entire lifetime. The survival instinct she had cultivated for 10 long years shouted with a voice she knew too well. Run. This isn't your problem. The police will come, they'll check identification, they'll find out who you are, and they'll send you straight back to Pratt. You've been free for 3 weeks. Don't ruin everything for a stranger. But another voice rose up, smaller and quieter, yet strangely stubborn. Someone in there is dying. Someone is calling for help, and no one is coming. Then fear slipped in, cold and sharp like ice water. You'll die with him. Gasoline is spilling everywhere. The engine is smoking. One spark and you'll burn alive with that car. You're 17 years old. You still have your whole life ahead of you. Don't do something stupid. Marin looked around, searching for someone, anyone, moving toward the wrecked vehicle, but all she saw were dozens of adults standing still. Strong men in business suits, women carrying expensive handbags, truck drivers with arms 3 times the size of hers. All of them stood safely back from the wreckage, phones raised to film or pressed against their ears calling emergency services. Not one person moved forward. Not one person stepped toward the fading cry for help. The memory came without warning, sharp as a blade. Marin saw herself again at 9 years old, curled into the corner of a dark closet, her eyes swollen from crying, her body aching from fresh bruises. She remembered whispering into the darkness, begging someone to come save her, begging any adult at all to hear her voice and take her away from that hell. But no one came. No one ever came. She had waited for 10 years, and the answer had always been silence. Help. Please." The voice from the wrecked car came again, weaker now, more desperate than before, and Marin realized that she couldn't do what everyone else had done to her. She couldn't stand there and turn away while someone slowly died only a few meters from where she stood. The decision came in 3 seconds. Marin threw her backpack onto the ground without caring who might take it or what might happen to it. $14 in her pocket. Half of a protein bar. An empty water bottle. Everything she owned in the world. She didn't care. She ran. Her torn sneakers struck the burning pavement, each step carrying her closer to the smoking wreck of twisted metal. A man in the crowd shouted behind her, "Kid, don't! It's gonna blow!" Marin didn't stop. She didn't look back. She ran faster, her lungs burning from the hot air and the thick smell of gasoline. Inside her mind, one thought rang out as clearly as a bell. If I die today, at least I die doing something right. Not dying in Pratt's house like an abandoned dog. Not dying from despair and loneliness, but dying because I chose to be the person no one had ever been for me. She reached the wreckage and dropped to her knees beside the twisted mass that had once been the white Range Rover. The smell of gasoline here was even stronger, burning her eyes and making her head spin. Smoke from the van's engine drifted around her like poisonous fog. She looked around, searching for a way inside, searching for the source of the desperate voice. The only opening was a narrow space between the van pressing down and the crushed body of the Range Rover. Small, dark, dangerous, but just wide enough for a thin 17-year-old girl. Marin lowered herself to the ground, her stomach pressed against the asphalt. Broken glass sliced into her palms and fresh blood ran across her skin, but she felt no pain. She didn't care. Slowly, she began to crawl forward on her belly, inch by inch, squeezing into the dark gap between the two wrecked vehicles. She had to get inside. She had to find the person who was calling for help, and she would not let go. The gap between the overturned van and the crushed Range Rover was barely half a meter wide, pitch dark and suffocatingly tight. Marin crawled inside, her elbows and knees scraping across the blistering pavement scattered with broken glass. She could feel every pebble, every jagged sliver of metal tearing against her skin, but she did not stop. The smell of gasoline here was so overwhelming that her stomach twisted violently, and nausea rose into her throat. She tried to hold her breath, but the air around her was so thick with fuel that every inhale felt like swallowing poison. Faint light slipped through narrow fractures in the twisted metal, casting thin, pale streaks through the darkness. And in that dim light, Marin saw him. The young man trapped inside the wreckage of the Range Rover. The roof had collapsed downward, pressing heavily against his chest so that every breath was a desperate struggle. His leg was pinned beneath the crushed dashboard. His light brown hair was matted with blood from a cut on his forehead, and the blue eyes that were probably very bright in other moments were now wide with panic and pain. He was about 20, maybe 21, and Marin recognized him immediately as the same young man she had seen leaning against this vehicle at the gas station, laughing into his phone. The one with the gentle smile among the cold-faced men. His eyes met hers, and Marin saw shock flash across his face. "Hey," Marin said, her voice calmer than she actually felt. "Hey, look at me. I'm here now. You're not alone anymore." The young man tried to speak, but only ragged breaths came out. "I can't," he groaned, his voice strangled by pain. "I can't breathe. My dad, he's up ahead." "Don't talk," Marin cut in, her voice firm but gentle. "Save your breath. What's your name?" Weston. "I'm Marin," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Listen to me, Weston. The ambulance is coming. I can hear the sirens." It was a lie. Marin heard nothing, except the frightening creak of shifting metal and the distant murmur of the crowd outside. But she needed him calm. She needed him to believe things would be all right, even if she wasn't sure that was true. The van above them suddenly shuddered, metal groaning with a sharp cracking sound like bones snapping. Marin looked up, her heart skipping a beat. The van was tilting, sliding, threatening to collapse completely onto the Range Rover beneath it. If it dropped even one more inch, both of them would be crushed like insects beneath a heel. Weston realized it too. He looked at her, his blue eyes now filled with tears and dread. "You have to go," he said, his voice trembling. "It's going to explode. Please, get out of here." Marin did not answer with words. She reached through the shattered window frame, ignoring the shards of glass that sliced into her wrist, and took hold of his hand. Weston's hand was icy cold and shaking, But the moment he felt the warmth of her grip, he clung to it like a drowning man clutching his final lifeline. "I'm not going anywhere," Marin said, her voice as steady as steel. To hold his hand better, she slid forward until she was lying flat on the gasoline-soaked pavement. The cold liquid seeped through her hoodie and into her skin, stinging and dangerous. She knew that part of her body was now beneath the van. If it collapsed, she would die beside Weston. But she did not let go. Tears streamed down Weston's face, mixing with the blood from his forehead. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You don't know me. Why are you staying?" Marin looked at him. And in that moment she was no longer a 17-year-old runaway lying beneath a vehicle that might explode at any second. She was the 9-year-old child curled inside a closet, crying in the darkness and waiting for someone to come rescue her. Someone who never came. She was the 12-year-old girl passed from one foster home to another, learning not to hope, because hope only led to disappointment. She was every forgotten child, every abandoned child, every child treated as though they did not exist. She gave him a small smile, a smile so sad it almost hurt to see. "Because I know what it feels like to cry for help and have no one come." Weston stared at her, his blue eyes wide with silent understanding. Then he tightened his grip on her hand, as though she were the only thing keeping him from falling into the darkness. They lay there together in the suffocating shadow between the two wrecked vehicles, their hands locked together, waiting for death to come for them. Or waiting for a miracle. The screech of sudden braking tore through the air, followed by the violent slam of car doors that cracked like gunshots. The black Escalade convoy had turned around, racing back against traffic on the highway with reckless speed. Only minutes earlier they had realized the white Range Rover had gone silent. The GPS signal showed it had stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, and when the first reports of an accident began spreading over the radio, the blood in Conrad Ashford's veins seemed to freeze. He stepped out of the car before the Maybach had even fully stopped, his expensive leather shoes striking the blistering pavement. His gray eyes swept across the chaotic scene, across the crowd of onlookers, across the endless line of stalled cars, searching for his son's vehicle. Then he saw it, the white Range Rover he had given Weston for his 20th birthday. The car his son had proudly driven everywhere. Now it was nothing more than a twisted mass of metal crushed beneath the enormous weight of a delivery van. For 20 years, ruling the underworld, Conrad Ashford had built himself an armor no one could break. People called him the Wolf because of his cold brutality, because he could make deadly decisions without the slightest hesitation. He had seen death. He had caused death. He had lived beside death as if it were an old companion. But in this moment, all of that armor vanished like morning mist beneath the sun. The steel-cold strength in his eyes shattered. The mask of the powerful mafia boss fell away, revealing the face of a father staring into the worst nightmare of his life. "Weston!" His roar ripped through the air, echoing across the crash site. It was not the calm and controlled voice his men were used to hearing. It was the desperate cry of a father, seeing his child on the edge between life and death. Conrad rushed toward the wreckage, ignoring the gasoline pooling beneath his feet, ignoring the smoke rising from the van's engine. Jet, his right-hand man, ran after him and grabbed his arm. "Boss!" Jet shouted urgently. "Gasoline everywhere! It could blow!" Conrad tore free from Jet's grip with the strength of a wild animal. He didn't care. He didn't care if the vehicle exploded and burned him alive with it. His son was inside. His only son. The last living piece of the wife he had lost. He dropped to his knees beside the wreckage, gripping the twisted metal frame with both hands as he tried to look inside. And then he froze for the second time that day. Inside the suffocating darkness and the heavy smell of gasoline, he saw his son. Weston was alive, barely breathing, his face covered in blood, but alive. Yet what Conrad could not believe was not the condition of his son. It was the girl, a small, thin girl in a dirty gray hoodie, lying directly beneath the van that threatened to collapse at any second. She was holding Weston's hand through the shattered window frame, lying motionless in a pool of gasoline, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Her dark brown eyes lifted to meet his gray ones, and there was no fear in them. Only an astonishing, unbreakable determination. "Are you his father?" the girl asked, her voice unbelievably calm in the middle of death and destruction. "Help me get him out." Conrad stared at her. The man who had faced hundreds of enemies without the slightest tremor now found himself shaking before a thin girl who had appeared out of nowhere. Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The girl smiled, a strange smile in the middle of this hell of gasoline and fire. Someone who doesn't let go. Conrad said nothing more. He lay down beside the stranger, reaching both hands into the crushed vehicle to grasp his son's hand. Weston opened his eyes, saw his father, and tears rolled down his cheeks. "Dad." "Son," Conrad whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." The smoke from the van's engine thickened, carrying waves of heat and the sharp scent of burning metal. Time was running out, and all three of them knew it. Conrad shifted into command mode in an instant. The instincts of a man accustomed to ruling an empire through the most dangerous crises, snapping into place without hesitation. "Jet, call the medical helicopter immediately," he ordered, his voice sharp as a blade. "The rest of you, get pry bars, crowbars, anything usable out of the trunks. Block traffic at both ends. No one gets close." His men moved like a perfectly programmed machine, each man taking a task without asking a single question. Jet pulled out his phone and called the family's private medical helicopter, while the others ran back to the convoy to retrieve tools. In less than a minute, 3 large men stood around the wreckage, gripping crowbars and metal levers. They tried to lift the crushed roof of the Range Rover, trying to force enough space to pull Weston out. Their muscles strained. Sweat poured down their faces. Groans of effort filled the air, but the metal would not move. It was too heavy. The van pressed down with tons of weight, and human strength could not fight against it. "Boss," one of the men gasped. "It's not moving. We need a crane, or specialized equipment." Conrad had not yet answered when Jet shouted from behind him. "Boss, fire." Everyone turned toward the van's engine. The thick black smoke had changed into bright orange flames that began in the engine compartment and slowly spread downward. The small flames crept along the fuel lines, moving steadily toward the gasoline pooling across the asphalt. "Boss, we're out of time," Jet shouted, and for the first time his voice carried real panic. Conrad looked down at the girl still lying beneath the wreckage, her hand still gripping Weston's. His gray eyes met her brown ones, and when he spoke, it was no longer an order. It was almost a plea. "Get out, now. That's an order." Marin looked at him, and in that moment she did not see a powerful mafia boss. She saw a desperate father begging her to leave so he could stay and die with his son without carrying the weight of another innocent life on his conscience. But she shook her head. Not without him. Conrad opened his mouth to speak again, ready to grab her and drag her out by force if necessary. But he never had the chance. The explosion came without warning. The van's engine erupted when the flames reached an auxiliary fuel tank. It was not the enormous cinematic blast people imagined, but a deep, violent boom, followed by a rolling sphere of orange fire bursting from the engine and racing across the vehicle with terrifying speed. Marin had only a fraction of a second to decide. In that brief instant, she did not think about herself. She did not think about fear, about pain, about the death rushing toward her. She thought only about Weston, the young man with the blue eyes now staring at her in pure terror. She threw herself forward, covering his body with her own, turning her thin frame into a shield between Weston and the oncoming fire. Heat and flames swept over them. Marin felt the moment the hoodie on her back caught fire. She felt the burning heat pierce through the fabric and bite into her skin. The pain struck like lightning, savage and unbearable. Her scream tore from her throat, blending with the roar of the flames, raw and agonizing beyond words. But her hand never released Weston's. Even as the fire burned across her back, even as the pain swallowed her consciousness, she held his hand as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. Conrad was thrown backward by the blast, his back slamming against the pavement. His ears rang with a dull, violent hum, his vision filled with fire and smoke, with the shapes of Jet and the other men rushing forward with fire extinguishers, blasting white foam across the raging flames. They dragged Marin from the wreckage, her small body completely unconscious in the arms of one of the men. The back of her hoodie had burned to charred fabric, revealing blistered red skin beneath, but she was still breathing. Weak, but alive. Weston was pulled out moments later, after the flames were controlled enough for the men to reach him. He was unconscious but alive, largely because the small, fragile body had shielded him from the first and most violent burst of fire. Conrad forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking as he walked toward the girl lying motionless on the pavement. He dropped to his knees beside her, his trembling hand touching the soot-covered face marked by burns. Who was this girl? A runaway child he had never known, a thin girl in a torn gray hoodie who possessed nothing but a pair of worn-out sneakers. In 20 years ruling the underworld, Conrad had met every kind of person imaginable. Men loyal for money, men obedient from fear, men willing to sacrifice themselves for power and schemes. But he had never met anyone like this girl. Someone willing to die for a stranger and ask nothing in return. The thundering blades of the helicopter tore through the scorching Nevada air as the Ashford family's private medical helicopter descended onto an open patch of desert a few hundred meters from the crash site. The medical team jumped out with stretchers and emergency equipment, rushing toward the two victims lying motionless on the pavement. Weston was lifted onto the first stretcher, an oxygen mask placed over his nose and mouth, while the nurses checked his vital signs. Marin was placed on the second stretcher immediately afterward, her small body positioned face down to prevent pressure on the severely burned skin across her back. Conrad climbed into the helicopter last, refusing to allow anyone to treat the small cuts and minor burns on his hands. He sat down between the two stretchers, his eyes never leaving his son and the strange girl who had saved him. Weston was unconscious but stable. The doctor aboard the helicopter reported that he had several broken ribs, a mild lung injury, and numerous cuts from shattered glass, but none of the injuries threatened his life. He would live. Marin was different. The girl had burns covering more than 30% of her body, most of them across her back and shoulders where she had taken the flames meant for Weston. Her condition was serious. She would require skin graft surgery and intensive treatment. The doctor spoke in a low, careful voice when he said that the next 24 hours would decide everything. Conrad studied the girl's face, small and pale beneath streaks of soot and the red edges of burn injuries. Even in unconsciousness, her expression carried a strange kind of peace, as if she had finally fallen into a deep sleep after many nights without rest. She was so young, 16, perhaps 17 at most, just a child. During the 20 years he had lived and worked in the underworld, Conrad had witnessed nearly every cruelty human beings were capable of inflicting on one another. He had seen betrayal from men he trusted most. He had seen greed turn friends into enemies. He had seen death arrive in countless forms, sometimes as quick as a bullet, sometimes as slow as poison. He had built his empire on one simple rule. Loyalty had a price, and he always paid that price in full. Conrad knew well that nearly everything in this world could be bought. The silence of witnesses, the votes of officials, the loyalty of soldiers, even the affection of beautiful women. Everything had its price, and he had never encountered anything that money could not purchase. Until today. This girl did not know who he was. She did not know how wealthy he was, how powerful he was, how dangerous he could be. She had asked for nothing, expected nothing, calculated nothing. She had simply seen someone who needed saving, and had been willing to die to save him. A complete stranger. The son of a man the entire underworld feared. But to her, Weston had only been a young man trapped in twisted metal who needed someone to hold his hand. Conrad looked at her face, and in the quiet of his mind a question rose. Who are you, little ghost? Where did you come from? And what made you the person you are? The helicopter shuddered lightly as it lifted into the sky, and Conrad made his decision. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, whatever her past might be, he owed her his son's life, and Conrad Ashford never forgot a debt. He took out his phone and called Jet, who had remained behind to handle the aftermath at the crash site. Jet. His voice was low and firm. Find out everything about this girl. Who she is, where she came from, where her family is, why she was out there alone. Everything. Yes, boss. Jet replied from the other end of the line. I'll start immediately. Conrad ended the call and looked out the helicopter window. Far below, the Nevada highway was shrinking into the distance, the crash site nothing more than a dark speck on a ribbon of pale asphalt. The helicopter flew toward the horizon, carrying a powerful mafia boss, his nearly lost son, and a runaway girl whose life was about to change forever. Marin opened her eyes and did not recognize anything around her. The ceiling soared high above, painted a soft ivory white, with a crystal chandelier scattering gentle light from the sun that filtered through silk curtains. The room was larger than the entire apartment she had once lived in at Pratt's house, with pale oak paneled walls, a cream leather sofa, and modern medical equipment arranged neatly beside the bed. This was not a public hospital. In fact, it did not resemble any place she had ever seen in all 17 years of her life. The pain came a moment later, violent and merciless. Her back felt as if thousands of needles were piercing it at once. Every breath was like an invisible blade cutting into her flesh. She tried to lift her hand and noticed the intravenous line in her vein, clear fluid dripping steadily. Thick bandages wrapped her body from shoulder to waist, pulled tight enough to make breathing difficult. The survival instinct she had sharpened for 10 long years awakened immediately. Where am I? Who brought me here? Where is the exit? Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the door, the window, anything that might help her escape if necessary. She tried to sit up, ignoring the agony tearing through her body. Tears spilled down her cheeks when the burned skin on her back stretched, but she clenched her teeth and swallowed the cry that threatened to escape. She had endured worse pain than this. She would not let anyone see her weakness. "You shouldn't move like that." The warm voice came from the corner of the room, and Maren flinched. She turned toward the sound and saw him, the man with black hair streaked with silver and eyes as cold and gray as steel, the same man she had seen at the gas station. He sat on the leather sofa in the corner with one leg crossed over the other, holding a newspaper as if this were the most ordinary morning in the world. His three-piece suit was perfectly pressed without a single crease, as though he had not been anywhere near an explosion only days earlier. Maren's heart beat faster as she realized he had probably been sitting there for hours, watching her sleep, waiting for her to wake. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Where am I?" The man folded the newspaper and placed it on the coffee table beside him before rising to his feet and walking toward her bed. Every step carried quiet authority and absolute control, like a wolf approaching its prey without hurry, because it knows the prey cannot escape. "I am the father of the man you saved," he said in a calm, emotionless tone. "And you are in my private medical facility." Maren studied him, studied the luxurious room, studied the expensive medical equipment, and the pieces in her mind slowly began to fit together. The convoy of black vehicles, the men in suits with the eyes of predators, the silent fear others seemed to have of him. She looked straight into his eyes, her brown gaze steady even though her heart was pounding like a drum. "You're Mafia, aren't you?" Conrad Ashford, because that was his name, though Maren did not know it yet but soon would, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. The smile did not reach his eyes, but it carried no threat either. "I am a businessman," he replied, "with diverse investments." Maren was not fooled by that answer. She had lived long enough in darkness to recognize it when she saw it. "Am I a prisoner?" she asked directly. Conrad tilted his head slightly as he studied her, and something in his expression resembled curiosity, perhaps even respect. "You are a guest," he said slowly. "A guest who saved my son's life." Before Maren could ask another question, a gentle knock sounded at the door, and it opened. The person who entered was the young man with light brown hair and blue eyes whose hand she had held in the wreckage. Weston looked weak, one arm in a sling and stitches visible across his forehead, but he was standing, and he was looking at her with an expression she did not quite know how to name. "You're awake," Weston said softly, a faint smile on his face. "I had to see it myself." The girl who refused to let go of my hand. Maren looked at him, and the memory of the suffocating darkness, the smell of gasoline, and the desperate grip of his hand came rushing back. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentler than she intended. Weston nodded and stepped closer to the bed. "Because of you," he said, and his voice trembled slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Maren interrupted, uncomfortable with the idea of anyone owing her gratitude. Weston looked at her for a long moment before turning toward his father. "Dad," he said firmly, "whatever she needs. At any cost." Conrad nodded once, his gray eyes still fixed on Maren. "I know." Maren looked at the two men standing in the luxurious hospital room, a powerful mafia boss and the son she had nearly died to save. She did not know whether she should trust them or fear them. She did not know if this was an opportunity or a trap. But she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in 17 years of her life, someone was looking at her as if she mattered. The next day, Conrad returned to Maren's room alone. This time he did not bring a newspaper. Instead, he carried a dark brown leather briefcase. He set it on the table beside her bed, opened it, and took out a thin file. "Maren Holloway," he read aloud, his voice calm and even as if reciting a financial report. 17 years old, runaway, wanted by the state, no family, no violent criminal record, just a ghost. He looked up at her, his gray eyes unreadable. Maren remained silent, her brown eyes sharpening with the alert tension of a wild cat cornered against a wall. She had known this moment would come. A man like him would never allow someone to remain under his roof without knowing exactly who they were. "You can tell me your story yourself," Conrad said. His voice was neither threatening nor offering. "Or I can learn it another way." "Your choice." Marin studied him carefully, weighing the options in her mind. She could lie, but she knew a man like him would uncover the truth sooner or later. She could stay silent, but that would only make him more suspicious. And the truth was simple. If he had wanted to harm her, she would already be dead. He had days to do whatever he wished while she lay unconscious. So she chose to tell the truth. "I entered the foster care system when I was 7, she began, her voice dry and distant as if she were describing someone else's life. "My parents died in a car accident. No relatives wanted to take me in, so I became property of the state." She paused, drawing in a careful breath despite the pain in her burned back. 10 years. 7 different foster homes. Some were indifferent. They only wanted the monthly checks. Some were not indifferent. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Conrad understood the meaning well enough. "Douglas Pratt was my last foster father," Marin continued. For the first time, her voice trembled slightly when she spoke his name. "According to the records, he is a model citizen. Church every Sunday. Loved by the neighbors. Trusted by social workers." She gave a faint smile that carried no trace of humor. "The truth is different." She did not describe the details. She did not need to. The nights locked inside the closet. The beatings when he came home drunk. The threats whispered in her ear if she dared tell anyone. And the final night, when he staggered through the door in a drunken rage and left her with a cracked rib. "I ran, because I knew that if I stayed, I would not live to see 18, she finished, her tone cold and detached as if discussing the weather. The room fell into silence. Marin watched Conrad, waiting for his reaction. Pity, disgust, indifference. She was familiar with all three. But what she saw surprised her. Conrad's face remained calm, yet his hand had tightened into the armrest of the chair so hard that his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was clenched, and inside those cold gray eyes she saw a fire beginning to burn. Not anger at her, anger for her. "This Douglas Pratt," Conrad said at last, his voice low and dangerous like distant thunder before a storm. "He is still out there." Marin nodded. "He is probably looking for me. The state will return me to him. That is how the system works." Conrad stood and walked toward the window, his back turned to her. Sunlight cut across his silhouette, turning him into a dark figure framed against the bright glass. "Not anymore," he said quietly, though the weight of the words sounded like a vow. "From this moment on, you are under my roof. No one touches you. Not the police, not the state, not Pratt. No one." Marin stared at his back, struggling to understand. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "You do not know me." Conrad was silent for a long moment. Then he turned back toward her, and for the first time Marin saw something different in his eyes. Not coldness, something older. A pain that had cooled over time but had never truly healed. 5 years ago my wife was killed, he said, his voice heavy like stone. I could not protect her. I had an empire, hundreds of men working for me, money and power beyond measure, and still I could not protect the woman I loved. He stepped closer to Marin's bed, his eyes fixed on hers. But you, a child no one cared about, a runaway girl with nothing in the world, protected my son. You gave me a chance to repay a debt I owe the universe. Something inside Marin broke open, not in pain, in release. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she could not stop them. For the first time in 10 years, someone truly wanted to protect her. Not for a monthly payment, not out of obligation, but because they actually cared. Rest now, Conrad said gently, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Heal. We will deal with everything together. He walked out of the room, leaving Marin alone with her tears and the first fragile spark of hope she had felt in an entire decade. A week passed, and Marin had recovered enough to walk around the room without assistance. The burns across her back still throbbed whenever she moved, but Dr. Webb said she was healing faster than expected. Youth and remarkable resilience, he had said. Marin knew the truth was simpler than that. She was used to pain. Her body had learned to heal quickly during the years she survived in Pratt's house. That afternoon, Marin was sitting on the sofa in the private sitting room arranged for her, trying to read a book Weston had brought, when the television mounted on the wall suddenly switched to a news broadcast. She reached for the remote to turn it off, but the images on the screen froze her in place. It was footage of the crash. Someone in the crowd that day had recorded everything. The video showed Marin running toward the burning wreckage, crawling into the narrow gap between the vehicles, and then the explosion. The footage replayed in slow motion, zoomed in, analyzed from every angle. The reporter called her the girl who wouldn't let go and the angel of the Nevada highway. They praised her courage, comparing her to heroes from action films, wondering about the identity of the mysterious girl who had risked her life to save a stranger. Then the screen changed to another image. Her identification photo from the state records. Marin Holloway, 17 years old, runaway minor, wanted by the state of California. The reporter explained that she had fled from her legal guardian 3 weeks earlier and was considered a vulnerable runaway who needed to be returned to a safe environment. The blood in Marin's veins turned to ice. They had found her. They knew who she was, and they would send her back to Pratt. Don't watch that garbage. Weston's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face dark with anger as he looked at the television screen. He walked over and sat beside her, reaching for the remote and switching the television off. But Marin could not ignore what she had just seen. "They are going to take me back," she said, her voice trembling. "They will send me back to him." Weston looked at her, and something hard and unyielding appeared in his blue eyes. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice completely serious. "And believe me, my father has already made it clear. Anyone who wants to touch you will have to go through him first." In the room next door, Conrad was watching the same broadcast. His gray eyes darkened like a storm gathering over the sea as he watched Marin's face on the screen beneath the scrolling headline, labeling her a dangerous runaway. He had known this moment would come. He simply had not expected it to come so quickly. The doorbell rang less than an hour later. Jet went to answer the door and returned with a tense expression. "Boss," he said briefly. "Social services, with police." Conrad nodded and stood, adjusting the collar of his suit. "Show them into the main living room, and keep Marin in her room." In the front hallway, a middle-aged woman with neatly cropped gray hair stood between 2 uniformed police officers. She carried a leather briefcase and a folder of documents, her expression stern like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "I am Patricia Dunn, from Child Protective Services," she said when Jet escorted them inside. "We have a court order. Marin Holloway is a minor under the custody of the state." Jet stood between them and the interior hallway of the house, his arms crossed over his chest like a wall of stone. "The patient is still recovering," he said coldly. "No visitors." Patricia frowned, her voice sharpening. "This is not a request. She is a runaway minor." Before Jet could reply, a deep voice spoke from the staircase. "Is there a problem here?" Conrad Ashford descended the stairs with measured, confident steps. He wore a flawless gray 3-piece suit, his hair neatly combed back, looking as though he were heading to a boardroom meeting rather than confronting the police inside his own home. Patricia turned toward him, and Marin could almost see the moment she realized who she was facing. The color drained slightly from her face, though she struggled to maintain her professional composure. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice less firm than before, "we have a court order to return Marin Holloway to state custody." Conrad stopped a few steps away from them. His gray eyes passed over the 3 visitors with the distant indifference of a man observing minor obstacles in his path. "That girl suffered 3rd-degree burns across more than 30% of her body while saving my son," he said, his voice cold as ice. "She is not going anywhere until she has fully recovered. If you wish to argue the matter, you may speak with my attorneys." As if the moment had been rehearsed, the door to the study opened, and a woman stepped out. Catherine Mercer. Short platinum hair, an elegant gray suit, and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She carried a stack of documents and handed them directly to Patricia. "A temporary stay issued by Judge Holt," Catherine said calmly. "Marin Holloway will remain here under medical supervision until the next hearing. You may leave now." Patricia scanned the document quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked up at Conrad, and something in her eyes was both anger and warning. "This is not over, Mr. Ashford," she said before turning and walking out, the 2 police officers following behind her. Conrad watched them until the door closed, then turned his gaze toward the hallway that led to Marin's room. He knew she had heard everything from the corridor. "They will return," he said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of a promise. "But but so will we." He turned and walked away, unaware that somewhere else in the city another pair of eyes was watching the news about the mysterious girl inside the Ashford estate. And those eyes did not belong to the police. Those eyes belonged to a man sitting in the darkness of another mansion, dozens of miles from the Ashford estate, yet no less luxurious. The luxury here, however, carried a different tone. If Conrad's home radiated controlled power, this place radiated something far colder. Heavy curtains sealed every window, allowing no light to enter. The furniture was dark and severe, its sharp lines designed more to intimidate than to welcome. And the man sitting at the center of the room, in a black leather armchair that resembled a throne, was the source of that chill. Preston Vance, 45 years old, leader of the Vance family, and the longtime enemy of the Ashford dynasty. His pale blonde hair was slicked back. His face was angular, marked by a nose that had once been broken. His pale blue eyes were cold and lifeless, like the eyes of a dead fish. He was watching the report about the Nevada highway accident on a massive television screen, a glass of whiskey turning slowly in his hand. When the footage of the mysterious girl running into the fire played for the third time, Preston switched off the television and turned toward the man waiting quietly in the corner of the room. "Tell me what you know," he said. His voice was smooth as velvet, yet heavy with threat. The subordinate, a large man with a scarred face, stepped forward and bowed his head slightly. "Ashford is distracted, sir. His son nearly died. Now he is busy playing foster father to some street girl from the foster care system. He even confronted social services and the police this afternoon." Preston chuckled softly, though the sound never reached his eyes. It resembled the hiss of a snake more than the expression of amusement. "Conrad Ashford," he murmured, his voice thick with mockery. "The great wolf, the man the entire East Coast underworld fears. And now he kneels for a little girl." He placed the whiskey glass on the table and rose, walking toward the window to stare into the darkness outside. "He is emotional. He is distracted. This is the opportunity we have been waiting for." The subordinate nodded, excitement flashing in his eyes. "Should we strike his territory now, sir?" Preston lifted a hand, silencing him. "Not yet," he said thoughtfully. "Let him grow more attached to the girl. Let him fight the system, the courts, the police. Let him stretch himself thin across every battlefield." He turned back, his pale blue eyes gleaming in the darkness. "And when he is exhausted, when he finally exposes a weakness, we will strike." His smile widened, cruel and patient. "The wolf will learn what it feels like to be hunted." At that same moment, inside the Ashford estate, Conrad sat in his study when his private phone began to vibrate. He glanced at the screen, recognized the number belonging to an informant embedded within the Vance organization, and answered the call. The conversation was brief, but it was enough to darken the steel gray of his eyes. When he ended the call, he summoned Jet into the room. "What is it, boss?" Jet asked immediately, noticing the tension in Conrad's face. Conrad rose and walked toward the window, his back turned toward his right hand. "Vance is watching us," he said quietly. "They know about Weston. They know about the girl. They are waiting." Jet muttered a curse beneath his breath. "So we are fighting on two fronts," he said. "The state wants the girl. Vance wants our blood." Conrad nodded slowly, his gray eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. "So what do we do?" Jet asked. Conrad was silent for a moment, then he turned to face him. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a man defending himself. It was the gaze of a wolf preparing to strike. "We do what we have always done," he said, his voice as hard as steel. "We protect what belongs to us, and we destroy anyone who dares threaten it." He turned back toward the window again, his reflection in the glass appearing like a ghost in the night. 20 years in this world had taught him that nothing remained safe forever. His wife had died because he allowed his guard to slip. He would not make that mistake again, not with his son, and not with the small girl who had risked her life for his family. While Conrad prepared for the coming war with the Vance family, he did not forget the other front in this battle. Douglas Pratt, the man who had turned Marin's life into hell, the man the system wanted to send her back to. Conrad had no intention of allowing that to happen. He called Corbin Drake the next day. Corbin was a legendary private investigator, a former FBI agent with more than 20 years of experience, digging up secrets people had buried as deeply as possible. He was expensive, difficult, and absolutely discreet. Exactly what Conrad needed. I need you to investigate a man named Douglas Pratt in Sacramento, Conrad said over the phone. Everything, from what he eats for breakfast to the skeletons he keeps hidden in his closet. Corbin flew to Sacramento that same day and began his work. The investigation was not easy. The neighborhood where Pratt lived was a peaceful suburb filled with clean, single-story houses and carefully trimmed lawns. Pratt was known as a model citizen, a kind-hearted single man who took in orphaned children. The neighbors admired him. The church praised him. Social workers trusted him. But Corbin had been in this profession long enough to know that the most dangerous monsters often wore the most ordinary faces. He began knocking on doors, speaking with the residents one by one. Most refused to talk, or did nothing but praise Pratt endlessly. Yet Corbin noticed something in the eyes of a few of them. Hesitation. Fear, carefully hidden. He focused on those people, persuading them, sometimes gently reminding them that their silence might allow more children to be hurt. Eventually, an elderly woman who lived right next door to Pratt agreed to speak. Sometimes we heard screaming, she said quietly, her voice trembling and her eyes unable to meet Corbin's gaze. At night, but he always explained that the children had nightmares, that they had psychological problems because of their difficult childhoods. He seemed so normal that no one ever suspected anything. The real breakthrough came when Corbin found Jenny Lawson, 24 years old, one of Pratt's earliest foster children, now living on the streets of Sacramento in a tent settlement for the homeless. The young woman had brittle brown hair, pale skin, and the haunted eyes of someone who had seen far too much darkness. At first, Jenny refused to speak. "I don't want trouble," she said, glancing around nervously as if someone might be watching. "He will find me." Corbin knelt down in front of her, his voice gentler than most people expected from a former FBI agent. "There is a 17-year-old girl who just escaped from him," he said. "If we don't stop him, she will be sent back, and there will be more children after her." Jenny was silent for a long time. Her eyes grew red with unshed tears, and Corbin could see her fighting with herself, struggling against the fear that had followed her for years. Then she began to speak. "He never hid us where anyone could see," Jenny said, her voice trembling but determined. "He was very smart, and when we told anyone, no one believed us. We were just foster kids, the children nobody wanted. Our words meant nothing." Corbin recorded Jenny's testimony, his hand gripping the pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In 20 years of doing this work, he had seen many terrible things. He had investigated murders, human trafficking rings, and crimes too horrifying for ordinary people to imagine. But something about children abandoned by the system and then abused by the very person assigned to protect them made him feel sick. He continued his investigation and eventually found 2 more former foster children of Pratt willing to testify. He obtained security camera recordings from a neighbor's house, capturing the faint echoes of screaming during the night. He dug into hospital records and discovered a chilling pattern. Of the 12 children Pratt had fostered during the past 15 years, 9 had been admitted to hospitals for injuries described as accidents, broken bones, bruises, burns, every single one recorded as an accident. 1 week after arriving in Sacramento, Corbin called Conrad. "I have enough evidence to bury him," he said, unable to hide the anger in his voice. "This man is a monster hiding in plain sight." Conrad sat in his study with the phone to his ear, his gray eyes hard as steel. "Then bring him into the light." The moment the call ended, Conrad summoned Catherine Mercer. The platinum-haired attorney listened carefully as he summarized Corbin's findings, and then nodded with quiet determination. "I will prepare everything," she said. "The documents, the witnesses, the evidence. We will not only keep Marin away from him, we will make sure he never touches another child again." Catherine began working without pause, assembling a legal case that grew into a 400-page file. The real battle was about to begin, but Douglas Pratt was not the kind of man who sat quietly and waited for death. When news spread through Sacramento that Marin was being protected by a wealthy family in Nevada, when Corbin Drake's quiet investigation began stirring the calm surface of his carefully constructed life, Pratt realized he needed to act, and he acted in a way no one expected. He hired a lawyer, not the kind of public defender the state assigned to difficult cases, but a lawyer who specialized in media crises, a man known for helping disgraced figures reverse public opinion. And he contacted the press. 1 week after Catherine Mercer finished assembling her 400-page case file, Marin was sitting in the living room watching the news when Douglas Pratt's face appeared on the screen. Her body froze as if a ghost from the past had stepped through the television and into the room. Pratt sat on the sofa of a morning talk show, his eyes red as though he had been crying, his voice trembling with emotion. He looked like a grieving father, a victim of cruel circumstance, a good man wronged by fate. "I only want my daughter to come home safely," he said to the camera, his voice breaking. "Marin is everything I have. I have raised her since she was 12 years old. I have loved her as my own child. And now that man, that dangerous criminal, is holding her. He is manipulating her mind." He paused, raising his hand to wipe his eyes in a gesture so perfectly measured it might have been rehearsed. "Marin is a vulnerable child. She has suffered trauma. She needs to come home, to receive treatment, to be loved, not to be exploited by a mafia boss for whatever dark purpose he may have." The broadcast shifted back to the reporter in the studio, reading the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Notorious mafia boss abducts vulnerable teenage girl. Is Marin Holloway a victim of organized crime?" Marin felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at Pratt's face on the television, the same face she had seen twisted with drunken rage, the same face that had looked down at her when she lay curled on the floor clutching her aching ribs. And now that face was performing grief before millions of viewers. "They are making him the victim," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They are making Conrad the villain." Weston walked into the room at that moment. When he saw what was on the screen, his face drained of color. He switched off the television immediately and turned toward Marin, but she had already risen to her feet, trembling uncontrollably. The situation grew worse with each passing day. News outlets rushed to cover the story, but the perspective had completely shifted. Instead of the heroic girl who wouldn't let go, Marin was now described as a fragile teenager being manipulated by organized crime. Instead of a father saving his son, Conrad was portrayed as a mafia boss kidnapping a minor. The hashtag #SaveMarin began spreading across social media, but the voices using it believed they were saving her from Conrad, not from Pratt. Pressure arrived from every direction. Police demanded additional search warrants. Conrad's legitimate business partners began to worry and withdraw their support. Investments were frozen. The reputation of the Ashford family had never suffered damage like this before. One night, Marin walked quietly to Conrad's study. She stood in the doorway, thin and trembling in the nightgown Weston had bought for her, looking like a small ghost inside the vast room. "I should leave," she said, her voice hoarse. "I am destroying everything you built. I am not worth." Conrad lifted his head from the papers spread across his desk, and the look in his eyes stopped her words. "Don't," he interrupted, his voice trembling in a way she had never heard before. "Never say that you are not worth it." He stood and walked toward her, and for the first time since she met him, Marin saw the calm authority leave his face. His gray eyes no longer looked like cold steel. They burned with something fierce and alive. "In my world, when you claim someone as your own, you do not abandon them," he said, each word heavy as stone. "Never. I could not protect my wife. I will not fail again." Marin stood there looking up at the most powerful man she had ever known, a man feared throughout the underworld, and she saw in his eyes the pain of someone who had once lost everything and sworn never to let it happen again. She did not cry. She had cried too much in her life already. Instead, she stepped forward and gripped the sleeve of his suit jacket, her small hand clutching the expensive fabric, as if it were the only lifeline she had left. Her eyes said everything she could not find the words to express. Conrad placed his hand on her shoulder, his large palm warm and steady. "We will fight," he said calmly, his composure returning. "Together, until the end." A moment later, he called Catherine Mercer into the study. When the platinum-haired attorney entered the room, Conrad was already seated behind his desk again. The cold steel had returned to his gray eyes, but now it carried a new determination. "Change the strategy," he said briefly. "We are no longer defending. We attack. It is time the world sees who Douglas Pratt truly is." That night, Marin could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with images from the news broadcast, with Pratt's carefully rehearsed face, with the fear that everything might collapse and she would be dragged back into hell. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep. She sat up and walked to the window, looking out into the dark garden beyond. A thin crescent moon cast faint silver streaks across the perfectly trimmed lawn. She was about to turn back toward the bed, when the survival instinct sharpened by 10 long years suddenly stirred inside her mind. Something was wrong. Marin narrowed her eyes and studied the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed it. A figure moving along the eastern wall where the security lights did not reach, then another, and a third. They moved quickly, silently, professionally, and they definitely were not the security guards of the Ashford estate. Marin did not panic. She did not scream. Instead, she stepped quietly away from the window and walked to the intercom panel mounted on the wall, the one she had been shown how to use when she first arrived. She pressed the button connecting to the security room, her voice low but clear. "Jet, someone is climbing over the eastern wall. 3 men. They are not ours." Jet's response came with astonishing speed. Within seconds, a silent alarm spread throughout the house, the kind that alerted security without warning the intruders. Marin looked back through the window and saw dark shapes from the Ashford security team moving through the garden, surrounding the trespassers from every direction. The confrontation was swift and eerily quiet. There were no gunshots, only the muffled sounds of bodies struggling in the darkness. When the garden lights finally came on, Marin saw 2 of the intruders fleeing back over the wall, while the third was pinned to the ground by 3 of Jet's men. Conrad appeared in the garden less than 5 minutes later. He wore a dark robe over his nightclothes, yet his eyes were sharp and alert, as if it were the middle of the day. He looked down at the captured intruder, nodded once to Jet, and the 2 of them disappeared into a room in the basement where Marin had never been allowed to go. She did not know what happened in that room, and she did not want to know. About an hour later, Conrad returned to the main living room where Marin and Weston were sitting together. Neither of them had been able to sleep again after what had just happened. Conrad's face showed no emotion, but Marin could see the quiet fire burning behind his gray eyes. "The Vance family," he said simply as Jet entered the room behind him. "They were planning to kidnap the girl and use her as a hostage to force me to surrender." Weston muttered a curse beneath his breath, his hands tightening into fists. But Conrad was not looking at his son. He was looking directly at Marin, and there was something in his gaze she had never expected to see. Respect. "You saved us," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note that sounded almost like astonishment. "Again." Marin shook her head awkwardly. "I only noticed something was wrong." Conrad smiled, one of the rare smiles she had ever seen from him. "You have good instincts, little one. Perhaps instincts that are too good." Weston rose from his seat and stepped beside his father, his expression more serious than Marin had ever seen before. "Dad, she is not just the girl who saved me anymore," he said firmly. "She is family. Our enemies already understand that. It is time we make it official." Conrad nodded once and turned toward Jet. "Send Preston Vance a message," he ordered, his voice cold as ice. "The girl is untouchable. Anyone who lays a hand on her answers to me directly." "And if he does not listen?" Jet asked. "Then we will have a different conversation," Conrad replied, the weight of a threat heavy in his tone. "After we deal with Pratt." He turned back toward the 2 young people standing before him, his son, whom he had raised for 21 years, and the 17-year-old girl Fate had brought into his family only weeks before. Both of them carried wounds for each other. Both of them had proven their loyalty. "Then we make it official," Conrad said, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had made an irreversible decision. "In court, once and for all." The courtroom was packed on the morning the hearing began. Reporters crowded the back rows, cameras and video equipment forbidden, but notebooks overflowing with hurried handwriting. The public had followed this case for weeks, from the story of the girl who would not let go to the accusations about a mafia boss kidnapping a vulnerable child. And now they had come to hear the truth with their own ears. Douglas Pratt sat at the defendant's table beside his attorney, a middle-aged man in a gray suit whose confidence bordered on arrogance. Pratt had prepared carefully for this day. He wore a conservative navy blue suit, a modest striped tie, his hair neatly combed. He looked every bit the image of a respectable citizen, a devoted foster father falsely accused. The confident smile on his lips even widened when he glanced across the courtroom to where Marin sat between Conrad and Weston. Catherine Mercer rose from her seat and walked toward the podium, carrying a thick file in her hands. She placed it down with a firm sound that echoed across the silent courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and sharp like the edge of a surgeon's blade. "In my possession is a 400-page file of documentation proving that Douglas Pratt is not the exemplary foster parent he claims to be. He is a systematic child abuser who has caused injuries to at least 9 of the 12 children who have lived under his roof over the past 15 years. Pratt continued smiling, leaning toward his lawyer to whisper something as though these accusations were nothing more than a passing joke. But that smile began to fade when the first witness was called. Jenny Lawson stepped onto the witness stand, thin and trembling, yet with eyes that did not waver. She spoke about the years she had spent in Pratt's house, about the beatings delivered in places where no one could see, about the times she had tried to tell social workers but no one believed her. "He made us believe that no one would ever believe us," Jenny said, her voice shaking yet unbroken. "But I am tired of being silent." Marin watched Pratt's face as Jenny spoke, and she saw the confident smile begin to stiffen. His complexion paled slightly when Jenny described in detail how he punished her for the smallest mistakes, how he locked her inside a closet for hours at a time. Next came Dr. Peterson, the physician who had treated several of Pratt's foster children over the years. He presented medical records and pointed out patterns of injury that did not match ordinary accidents, fractures in specific locations, bruises with distinct shapes. Pratt began to sweat, his hand trembling slightly as he scribbled something on a piece of paper for his lawyer. Then one of Pratt's neighbors took the stand, confirming the screams heard in the night for years that no one had ever reported, because they assumed the children were simply having nightmares. But the final blow came when Catherine played an audio recording taken from a neighbor's security camera. The sound filled the silent courtroom. The screams of a child. The sound of blows landing, Pratt's voice shouting threats that no one in that room could mistake. When the recording ended, Pratt's face had turned as white as paper. Sweat ran down his forehead, and the hand holding his pen now trembled like a leaf caught in a storm. Catherine stepped closer to him, her eyes cold as ice. "Mr. Pratt," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "can you explain why 9 of the 12 children under your care were hospitalized because of accidents?" Pratt licked his lips, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "They are clumsy children," he stammered. "Accidents happen." Catherine tilted her head slightly, her expression unmoved. "Accidents, or a pattern, Mr. Pratt." And that was when Pratt collapsed. He leapt to his feet, his face flushed crimson, veins bulging along his neck. "That girl is a liar," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger toward Marin. "She always causes trouble. I was only trying to help her. I am a good father." Judge Holt slammed the gavel down, the sound cracking through the room like thunder. "Mr. Pratt, sit down immediately." But Pratt did not listen. He continued shouting, the mask of the respectable citizen completely shattered, revealing the monster beneath. His lawyer tried to pull him back into his chair, but it was useless. Judge Holt struck the gavel again and signaled to the court officers. "Based on the evidence presented and the behavior of the defendant, the court orders the immediate arrest of Douglas Pratt on charges of child abuse, unlawful confinement, and deception of the court." 2 officers stepped forward and placed Pratt in handcuffs while he continued to shout, still pointing toward Marin, still insisting on his innocence. As they dragged him down the aisle between the rows of benches, Marin rose to her feet. She did not mean to, but her legs carried her upright without thought. Pratt stopped for a moment and his eyes met hers, and in that instant every ounce of fear she had ever felt toward him simply vanished. She looked straight into the eyes of the man who had turned her childhood into a living nightmare, and she did not tremble. She did not feel afraid. What she felt instead was a strange calm, the quiet peace of someone who had finally become free. Pratt was taken away, his shouting echoing down the hallway until the doors closed behind him. But the hearing was not over. Judge Holt looked down at the documents before him, then raised his eyes toward Marin. "With Mr. Pratt now under arrest, the court must determine the future of Marin Holloway," he said. "Where will the girl go?" Patricia Dunn rose to her feet, straightened the gray jacket of her suit, and walked toward the podium with the quiet confidence of someone who had performed this duty thousands of times. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the firm assurance of professional authority. "Although Mr. Pratt has now been placed under arrest, the Department of Child Protective Services still recommends that Marin Holloway be placed in a specialized care facility until she reaches the age of 18. Marin felt her heart sink inside her chest. She looked at Patricia, the woman continuing her statement with a face that showed not the slightest trace of emotion. "The reason is clear," Patricia went on. "Mr. Conrad Ashford, the man currently providing temporary care for the girl, has a questionable past and associations with business activities that cannot be fully verified. He is not a suitable guardian for a vulnerable young woman such as Marin." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marin glanced toward Conrad and saw that his face remained calm as stone. Yet she knew the quiet storm burning beneath that stillness. "She speaks of a questionable past without mentioning that the girl nearly died saving my son," Catherine Mercer said as she rose in objection, her voice cold and sharp. Nor does she mention that Mr. Ashford has provided her with the finest medical treatment, a safe home, and the care that the system she represents failed to give her for 10 years. Judge Holt raised a hand to silence them both. The room fell quiet, and he looked down at the documents before him for a long moment. Then he lifted his gaze and rested it on Marin. "Before I make a decision," he said, his voice deep with the weight of a man who had heard far too many stories inside this courtroom, "I would like to hear from Marin herself. Child, is there anything you would like to say?" Marin froze where she sat. In 17 years of life, no one had ever asked her what she wanted. No one had ever cared about her opinion. She had been nothing more than a number inside a system, a sheet of paper in a stack of files, a child passed from place to place like an unwanted object. And now, for the first time, a judge was asking her what she wished to say. She looked toward Conrad and saw him give a small nod of encouragement. She looked toward Weston and saw him smiling at her with complete faith. Then she stood up. Her legs trembled, but her steps remained steady as she walked toward the witness stand. She stood there, a thin 17-year-old girl in a simple dress, facing an entire courtroom filled with eyes watching her. She drew a deep breath and began to speak. "I have lived inside the system for 10 years. Her voice was quiet but clear. 7 different foster homes. And not one person, not a single one, ever asked what I wanted." She paused, swallowing hard, then continued. "I learned that adults only wanted money, control, power. They wanted everything except me. I was just a way for them to receive a monthly payment. I was just a name inside a file so they could fill out their reports." Her voice hardened slightly, carrying the weight of 10 years of abandonment. "I learned to become invisible. Because being seen meant being hurt. Because every time someone noticed me, they found a way to use me or break me. So I disappeared. I became a ghost." She turned and looked at Conrad, her dark brown eyes meeting his gray ones. "And then I met him." Her voice softened as she spoke the words. "He did not ask what I could give him. He asked what I needed." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Not a whisper, not the faintest rustle. "For the first time in my life, I had a table where I could sit and eat," Marin continued, her voice beginning to tremble. "I had a bed that belonged to me, not one I could be thrown out of at any moment. Someone asked how my day had been. Someone cared when I was sick. Someone looked at me as if I mattered." Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but she did not stop speaking. "I know he is not perfect. I know what people say about him. But he gave me something the system never could. A family." She looked directly into Judge Holt's eyes, her voice breaking but steady with conviction. "So if the court asks where I want to go..." She paused, tears flowing freely yet her gaze unshaken. "I want to go home. With him." The courtroom sank into absolute silence. Even Patricia Dunn, who had prepared dozens of arguments to counter this moment, could not speak. She simply sat there, her mouth slightly open, unable to find a single word to answer what the girl had just said. Marin turned her head toward Conrad and saw something she had never imagined she would witness. His gray eyes, cold as steel and feared throughout the underworld, were red with emotion. No tears fell, but they were there, shining under the courtroom lights. For the first time in many years, Conrad Ashford allowed someone to see his vulnerability. Judge Holt watched Marin for a long moment, before slowly nodding his head. "Thank you, child," he said, his voice gentler than she had heard before. He struck the gavel once against the bench. "The court will recess for 30 minutes before delivering its final decision." The 30 minutes of waiting became the longest 30 minutes of Marin's life. She sat on a hard wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, her feet not even touching the floor, her fingers interlaced and squeezed so tightly that the knuckles turned pale. Her heart beat so fast she could hear it inside her ears, each pulse sounding like a countdown toward the decision that would determine the rest of her life. Conrad sat beside her, his shoulder lightly touching hers. He said nothing. He did not try to comfort her with promises that might not come true. Yet his presence alone was enough. She could feel the warmth of his body beside her, feel the steadiness of him like a rock standing firm in the middle of a storm, and that quiet strength kept her from falling apart. Weston sat on her other side, and suddenly he reached across and took her cold hand in his. "No matter what happens," he said softly, his voice calm and certain, "you will always be my sister." Marin looked at him, the young man with the blue eyes whose hand she had held in the wreckage only a few weeks earlier, and she tightened her grip on his hand. The bell rang, signaling that the court session would resume. Marin rose on trembling legs and walked back into the courtroom between Conrad and Weston, the two men who had already become her family, even if the law had not yet recognized it. Judge Holt entered, his face unreadable. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the documents before him. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Not a breath could be heard. "In the matter concerning Marin Holloway," he began, his voice echoing gently through the quiet chamber, "the court rejects the request to place the child in a state care facility." Marin heard a quiet sigh of relief somewhere behind her, perhaps from Weston. She felt a small weight lift from her chest, but only slightly. She knew there was still more to come. However, Judge Holt continued, and the single word tightened Marin's heart once again. "The court cannot grant full guardianship to Mr. Ashford at this time." It felt as though someone had struck Marin in the stomach. She gripped Conrad's hand so tightly that she could feel the bone beneath his skin. No, it could not end this way. After everything they had endured, after everything she had just said, would they still take her away from the only family she had ever known? Instead, Judge Holt went on, and there was something different in his tone now. Almost warmer. "The court has received a separate petition. A petition for adoption submitted by Mr. Conrad Ashford, filed 3 weeks ago." Marin turned to Conrad, her eyes wide with shock. An adoption petition. 3 weeks ago. That meant he had filed it while she was still lying in the hospital bed, while she was still recovering from her burns, while she was still nothing more than a homeless runaway girl he had no obligation to care about. Conrad looked back at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw him smile. Not the faint, polite smile she had seen before, not the distant smile of social courtesy, but a real smile, warm and sincere, lighting the gray eyes that were usually so cold. "Based on the evidence of Mr. Ashford's commitment," Judge Holt continued, his voice carrying a quiet note of approval, "including psychological evaluations, showing significant improvement in Marin's well-being during her time in his care, and most importantly the testimony of Marin herself, the court approves the adoption petition effective immediately." The courtroom erupted. Applause burst out from every corner. There were sounds of laughter, and the unmistakable sound of people crying. Marin stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to believe what she had just heard. It felt like a dream, like she was floating inside a reality too impossible to be real. Weston was the first to embrace her. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and pulled her into a hug so tight she could barely breathe. "Welcome to the family, little sister," he whispered into her ear. "It is official now." Then Conrad rose and stepped toward her. He did not hug her the way Weston had. That was not something he was skilled at, and Marin understood that. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder, his large palm warm and steady, and looked into her eyes with an expression she had never seen from any adult in her entire life. The look of a father gazing at his daughter. "Come home, daughter," he said quietly, his voice deep and trembling. And Marin cried. These were not tears of fear, not tears of pain, not tears of despair. These were the tears of someone who had finally found a home. The Ashford family walked out of the courthouse together, beneath the bright Nevada sunlight. Conrad on the left, Weston on the right, and Marin between them. No longer a runaway girl with nowhere to belong. No longer a ghost wandering along the highway. She was Marin Ashford. And she was going home. 3 years later, the Nevada highway still burned beneath the fierce summer sun. The same stretch of Interstate 15, the same endless Mojave Desert spreading toward the horizon, the same waves of heat rising from the asphalt like invisible fire. Yet something about the convoy moving along the highway that day was different. The familiar black Escalades were still there. The luxurious Mercedes Maybach still glided quietly among them. But leading the convoy now was a cherry-red Porsche Cayenne, blazing brightly among the black vehicles like a flame in the night. Behind the wheel of that Porsche sat Marin Ashford, 20 years old. She was no longer the thin girl in a torn gray hoodie who had once stood trembling on this road 3 years earlier. Her brown hair now shone with health and had been carefully trimmed. Her dark eyes no longer carried the wary tension of a wild animal. Instead, they shone with the calm confidence of a young woman who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. The scars on her back remained, permanent reminders of the fire that had once nearly consumed her. Yet to Marin, they were no longer symbols of pain. They were proof of the day she found a family. She was now in her 2nd year of college studying psychology. She wanted to help children like herself, the forgotten ones abandoned by the system, The invisible ghosts no one cared enough to see. Weston sat in the passenger seat beside her. He was now the chief executive officer of the family company, the legal side of the Ashford empire. He was laughing about something, teasing Maren the way he always did, calling her little sister and joking that she drove faster than their father ever had. Behind them, inside the black Maybach, Conrad Ashford sat quietly, watching the red Porsche ahead. Jet sat beside him. Neither of them spoke, but their eyes followed the young woman driving ahead, as if she were the most precious treasure the family possessed, because in truth she was. "Have you heard anything about Preston Vance lately?" Weston asked casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I hear he has been very quiet these days." Maren smiled slightly, her eyes still fixed on the road ahead. Dad sent him a message he could not ignore. Weston let out a soft laugh. The Ashford family never forgets, and we never forgive. He learned that lesson the hard way. "What happened to him?" Maren asked, though she already suspected the answer. Weston shrugged, his expression carrying a strange mixture of pride and danger. "Let us just say Dad made it very clear that touching his family would bring consequences. Vance decided that peace was more profitable than war, at least for now." Maren nodded and did not ask any further questions. She had lived in this world long enough to understand that some details were better left unknown. The convoy continued forward until Maren realized they were approaching the place where the accident had once happened. She slowed the car slightly, her eyes lingering on the repaired stretch of road where, 3 years earlier, her life had changed forever. "Are you all right?" Weston asked quietly, noticing the shift in her mood. Maren nodded. "I am fine," she said. "I was just thinking about something. What if I had run away that day?" Weston was silent for a moment before answering in a serious tone. "Then I would have died. And Dad would have lost everything." Maren glanced at him and then smiled, the bright smile of someone who had discovered the meaning of her own life. She pressed the accelerator. The Porsche roared forward, leaving the place of the accident behind and carrying the past away with it. "It is a good thing I do not know how to give up," she said. Weston laughed loudly. The wind rushed through the open window, lifting Maren's hair, and in that moment she felt freer than she had ever felt before. People often say that blood is thicker than water, but what happened that day on the Nevada highway proved something very different. Blood only gives you a biological connection. Loyalty is what truly makes a family. She had begun that day as a runaway girl with nothing left to lose. She ended that day as a daughter with everything to live for. Sometimes it takes an empire to fight against a broken system. But all it takes to face death is one brave girl. Her name is Maren Ashford, and she is the girl who refused to let go. Maren's story leaves us with a powerful lesson about courage, resilience, and most importantly, the true meaning of family. Family is not always defined by shared blood. Sometimes family is the people who choose to stay beside you when the world turns its back. The people who fight for you when you no longer have the strength to fight for yourself. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share this video with the people you care about. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you will not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We would truly love to hear what you think about this story. Have you ever met someone like Maren in your life? Do you believe that sometimes strangers can become family? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always value hearing sincere feelings from the depths of your hearts. Finally, we wish everyone watching this video good health, happiness, and peace in your daily life. Thank you for spending this time with us. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.